I never imagined my dream of peaceful suburban living would begin with the sound of hedge trimmers and the shriek of a woman in pearls. The day started like any other. I'd just wrapped up a long shift at the site and was pulling into my driveway, eager to enjoy the quiet of my new home. Sunnyside Ridge, they called it. A tranquil, well-manicured community tucked away from the chaos of the city. That's what the brochure said anyway. But as I stepped out of my car, I froze. There, on my front lawn, were two workers with electric hedge trimmers, hacking away at the emerald green arborvitaes I just had planted along the side of my yard. They weren't trimming them. They were butchering them. Beautiful, thick privacy hedges reduced to sad, stumpy twigs in the dirt. Standing behind them like a general on a battlefield was a woman in a snow-white pantsuit, her chin tilted, arms crossed, lips pursed in visible satisfaction. Her golden bob haircut didn't move, not even in the afternoon breeze. I stormed across the lawn. "Excuse me, what the hell is going on here?" She turned, calm and composed. "Mr. Blake, I presume. I'm Victoria Grant, president of the Sunnyside Ridge Homeowners Association." Her voice was sweet, almost pleasant, but her eyes were cold steel. "You're destroying my hedges," Victoria didn't flinch. "Your hedges were in violation of Community Code 4.7b. They obstructed the designated corner sightline. As HOA president, I am authorized to enforce compliance measures when safety is at stake." Compliance? There was no warning, no notice. These were approved plants. She held up a manicured hand. A diamond tennis bracelet caught the light as she waved dismissively. "A community-wide email was sent last week. The board voted for emergency action. It's all in the handbook, Mr. Blake." I blinked. "You sent an email? That's not a formal notice. There's a process." "Not when safety is involved," she cut in. "You'll receive a bill for $375 for the landscaping service. Have a nice day." With that, she turned on her heel, handed cash to the workers, and strode off like a monarch who had just delivered her decree. I stood there, speechless, watching the remains of my $2,000 hedge investment rustle sadly in the wind. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table, thumbing through the 78-page community handbook Victoria had handed me 3 days after I moved in. At the time, I thought she was just another overly enthusiastic HOA leader, the type who loves hosting bake sales and holiday decoration contests. I was wrong. Everything about Victoria was curated, controlled, cold. She didn't enforce rules, she wielded them like weapons. When I first moved in, I'd wanted to make a good impression. I followed every single rule. My lawn, precisely 3.5 inches high. My mailbox, HOA approved, down to the matte black paint. My trash bins, only visible during the exact 12-hour allowance on collection day. I even painted my front door sandstone whisper, the only tan shade permitted for corner lots facing east. I became, for lack of a better term, invisible. And for 6 months, it worked. Victoria passed my house with barely a glance, while ticketing others for audible wind chimes, or overdue removal of seasonal decor. But now? Now she'd stepped onto my property and destroyed my legally planted hedges with no notice, no paperwork, just smug righteousness. I flipped to page 42, paragraph 6 of the handbook. There it was. Natural privacy barriers may be approved, provided they do not exceed 6 feet in height and do not impede visibility at designated corner zones. I measured everything before installation. 5 feet 10 inches tall, 15 feet back from the corner, all within code. And yet, they were gone. My jaw clenched. My fingers trembled with quiet fury. That night, a fire lit inside me. I wasn't just angry, I was insulted. I'd spent 15 years as a structural engineer, managing high-stress projects, working with strict regulations, impossible deadlines, and difficult clients. And now, I was being steamrolled by a woman with a clipboard and a god complex. No more. That's when I noticed something else buried deep in the handbook. Something that would change everything. A clause. A loophole. A weapon of my own. Victoria Grant wanted a war, and she had just picked the wrong man to fight. The next morning, I didn't wake up angry. I woke up focused. I poured my coffee, opened the HOA handbook, and began reading like my life depended on it. Not out of obedience, not anymore. Now I was hunting. There had to be something buried in this mountain of legalese, some hidden line, some overlooked clause, that would let me fight back. Page after page, I sifted through restrictions so ridiculous they felt satirical. There were 12 shades of beige approved for exterior paint. 12. Bird feeders had decibel limits. Halloween decorations couldn't include excessive blinking. But then, nestled on page 57, under structural modifications, I found it. Perimeter walls, constructed from approved materials, could legally be built up to 6 feet high, provided they adhered to county building codes and were approved by the HOA Architectural Committee. My hedges may have fallen under natural barriers, but a wall? That was a different beast entirely. It wouldn't just restore my privacy. It would become a monument to the principle that rules, when used right, can fight back. I smiled for the first time in days. That afternoon, I got to work, not with a shovel, but with blueprints. As a structural engineer, this was my playground. I drew up detailed architectural plans for a 6-foot-high cinder block wall, coated in desert tan, one of the community's approved neutrals. I included setback measurements, load-bearing calculations, drainage considerations, and even 3D renderings of how it would look when finished. Subtle, tasteful, immaculately within code. I printed 3 bound copies and sent them via certified mail to the HOA's Architectural Committee, with Victoria's name right at the top. According to Bylaw 7.3, they had 14 days to respond. If they didn't, automatic approval. And something told me Victoria wouldn't be in a hurry to review anything with my name on it. 14 days passed. I checked my inbox. Nothing. I checked my physical mailbox. Nothing. I even called the HOA office, twice. The woman on the other end, her voice clipped and uneasy, told me, "The committee is reviewing your request. Please wait for an official response." But there wouldn't be one. I later discovered that Victoria, who also chaired the Architectural Committee, never forwarded my application to the other members. She buried it, ignored it, dismissed it. Her mistake. On day 15, I rented a mini excavator, rolled it onto my lawn, and began digging the trench for my foundation. Neighbors peeked out their windows, some curious, some concerned. I kept my head down, working with surgical precision. And then came the inevitable sound of screeching tires. Victoria's luxury SUV slammed to a stop in front of my house. The door burst open, and out she came, high heels stabbing the grass like daggers, eyes blazing. "What do you think you're doing?" she barked, storming toward me like a hurricane in designer sunglasses. "Stop this immediately or I'm calling the police." I calmly shut off the excavator, climbed down, and met her in the yard, clipboard in hand. "Good afternoon, Ms. Grant," I said. "According to Bylaw 7.3, my wall has been automatically approved due to the committee's failure to respond within the required 14-day period." I handed her the stamped application packet, along with the certified mail receipt, signed by her. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, flipping through the pages. "I never saw this. You can't build a wall. It violates the aesthetic of the community." "Actually," I replied, "it matches the desert tan standard, meets all setback requirements, and complies with the county's structural code. It's all here. You're welcome to verify it with the city inspector." She sputtered, her face flushing a deep crimson that clashed horribly with her coral blouse. "I'm calling an emergency meeting of the board," she hissed. This loophole you're exploiting won't stand. You'll be forced to tear it all down." "It's not a loophole, Victoria," I said, stepping closer, lowering my voice. "It's your rule. The one you handed me. The one you enforce on everyone else. I'm just following it. Better than you ever did." Her eyes narrowed. Her lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. "You're playing a dangerous game, Mr. Blake." I smiled. "Good. I like to win." She turned and stormed off, the sound of her heels punctuating each step like a countdown to war. Over the next several days, I took time off from work and poured everything I had into building the wall. Concrete footings, rebar reinforcement, leveled cinder blocks. This wasn't some amateur DIY fence. This was a fortress. Neighbors stopped by, curious and quietly supportive. A few shared stories of their own run-ins with Victoria. fines for non-regulation holiday wreaths, threats over wind chimes, citations for leaving trash bins out 8 minutes too long. I was no longer just building a wall. I was building a symbol. And Victoria? She was about to find out that some rules cut both ways. The wall began to rise, one block at a time, one line of mortar after another. And with each new layer, I could feel it, my grip tightening on the one thing Victoria hated most: control. At first, she vanished. For nearly 3 days, not a sighting. I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd accepted defeat. But no, she was simply retreating to her war room, planning her next strike. And when she came back, she didn't come with words. She came with fines. On a crisp Monday morning, I opened my front door to find a bright pink violation notice taped to the glass. Construction materials improperly stored in a visible area. Remove within 24 hours or be fined $50 per day. I stared at the stack of neatly arranged cinder blocks by my driveway, all within my lot, well organized, no mess. The handbook did say materials shouldn't be visible, unless construction was actively ongoing. Page 63, Section 4, Paragraph 2. Active construction projects are permitted a 7-day material storage period, renewable upon visible progress. I was on day 5. Victoria was playing dirty, trying to corner me on a technicality. But I'd read every word of that book, twice. Instead of arguing, I acted. I rented a portable storage pod that same afternoon, loaded every material inside, and positioned it exactly 17 feet from the curb, 1 foot further than the minimum distance allowed. I even labeled the unit with my active construction permit and date of delivery, laminated and zip-tied to the handle. The next morning, I watched from my living room as Victoria's SUV crept by. She slowed down, rolled down her tinted window, and stared at the spotless pod. No visible materials. No violations. No victory. Her face twisted with disappointment before the SUV sped off again. I smiled, took a sip of coffee, and got back to work. But she wasn't done. A few days later, a county building inspector showed up at my door, hard hat under one arm, clipboard in hand. "Afternoon, sir. We received an anonymous tip you might be building without a permit." "Of course," I said with a sigh. "Right this way." I walked him through every permit I'd filed, showed him the engineering specs, photos, city approval stamps. I even had the emails from the county's planning office. He whistled low. "Honestly, this is some of the cleanest paperwork I've seen in months. Most homeowners cut corners. But this..." He patted the partially finished wall. "This is professional-grade masonry. You know your stuff." "Perks of the trade," I said, smiling faintly. He paused before leaving, lowering his voice. "Between you and me, this isn't the first complaint I've had from this neighborhood. There's been noise about that big fountain project near the entrance. Permits supposedly in process, but no one's seen 'em." My ears perked up. "You mean the one with the glowing lights and dancing water jets?" He nodded. "We've been chasing paperwork for months. Every time we stop by, the HOA says it's being handled." I knew Victoria was behind it. I could almost hear her voice in my head, calling it a community enhancement. I thanked the inspector, and after he left, I opened my laptop. 20 minutes of searching later, I had my answer. No permits had ever been filed for the fountain. Not a single one. Yet the project cost nearly $30,000, all paid for with HOA funds. I filed a formal complaint with the county. 3 days later, the fountain was cordoned off with yellow caution tape, a bright red stop work order nailed to the side of the stone base, and a $5,000 fine was issued to the HOA. Victoria was livid. She started walking the neighborhood like a hawk with a clipboard, inspecting trash cans, measuring grass, snapping photos of door wreaths. She issued a dozen more violation notices in the span of 1 week than she had all month. One neighbor told me she was fined for leaving a flower pot on the steps that wasn't in the approved planter list. "I think she's losing it," another whispered. But I wasn't satisfied with small wins. No, I wanted justice. So I dug deeper. I started talking to neighbors, quietly, carefully. I knocked on doors. I asked questions. I listened. And what I heard made my stomach churn. Victoria had fined a retired veteran down the street for flying a flag that was too large. She'd forced a single mom to repaint her door, twice, because the sunlight made it appear off-tone. She'd even threatened to have someone's lease revoked over a decorative bench. And then I met Mrs. Eleanor Price, a quiet, dignified woman who lived 3 doors down. She used to be the HOA treasurer, until Victoria had her ousted 2 years ago over philosophical differences. Over tea in her backyard, Eleanor confided in me. "The numbers never added up," she said softly. Maintenance costs tripled the month after Victoria hired her brother-in-law's landscaping company. When I asked to see invoices, she said they were confidential. That's not how HOA finances are supposed to work. I knew then, this wasn't just petty tyranny. This was abuse of power, of money, of people, and it had to stop. So, I began compiling everything, every violation, every inconsistency, every financial irregularity, every line from the handbook she had ignored when it suited her. I kept receipts, statements, pictures, signatures. I didn't just want revenge, I wanted accountability. I wanted to dismantle her house of cards brick by brick, just like I was building mine. And the timing couldn't have been better. The annual HOA meeting was just 2 weeks away, where board elections would be held, where the next year's budget would be reviewed, where the community would come together, perhaps for the first time, to see what kind of president had been ruling over them like a queen behind a curtain. Victoria didn't know it yet, but her kingdom was crumbling, and I was about to hand every resident the blueprint to her downfall. For weeks, I lived 2 lives. By day, I laid the final rows of my wall, smooth mortar lines, precision cuts, textured finish in HOA-approved desert tan. From a distance, it looked like any other well-constructed property divider. But to me, it was a fortress, my line in the sand. By night, I became something else. A researcher. A hunter. A man obsessed. The deeper I dug into Victoria Grant's reign over Sunnyside Ridge, the darker things got. What started with botched permits and inflated landscaping costs quickly unraveled into something much bigger. A pattern of manipulation, deceit, and deliberate silencing of anyone who stood in her way. And I wasn't alone. After my conversation with Mrs. Eleanor Price, the former treasurer, I began to quietly meet with other residents. People who, for years, had swallowed their frustration, thinking they were the only ones being targeted. There was Tom, the Gulf War vet fined for flying an American flag outside regulated dimensions. Jenna, a single mother forced to replace her front porch tiles because they had excessive texture. Mr. and Mrs. Alvarez, fined for overgrown vegetation because their ivy touched the base of their mailbox. Their stories echoed mine: petty citations, retaliatory inspections, threats of legal action if they dared push back. Victoria had built her power not on rules, but on fear. And fear is only useful if no one dares to challenge it. So I began assembling the Shadow Files, a 15-page report that detailed every procedural violation, financial irregularity, and abuse of power I could find. Each page was backed by hard evidence: HOA bylaws, annotated with sticky notes, copies of violation notices, financial statements showing thousands in unchecked expenses, testimonies from neighbors, photographs of unpermitted projects, and screenshots of emails ignored or dismissed by Victoria and her board loyalists. I made 100 copies, each sealed in a manila envelope with a bold black title on the front. Is this the leadership you want for Sunnyside Ridge? The HOA's annual meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center. Typically, only a dozen people bothered to show up. But this year would be different. I arrived an hour early, boxes of envelopes in hand. One by one, I handed them out as residents arrived. Quietly, respectfully, with only a nod. Most took them with confusion, some with curiosity, a few with clenched jaws, already knowing what they'd find inside. As the room filled, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations turned hushed. Pages turned. People pointed, whispered. The community center had never been this full. Over 90 homeowners in total, nearly triple the usual turnout. And then, 15 minutes late, Victoria walked in. Her heels clicked like gunshots across the polished tile. Her smile faltered the moment she saw the crowd, the moment she saw the envelopes. She scanned the room, locked eyes with me, and I watched it happen in real time. The flicker of recognition, the calculation, the dread. But she was nothing if not a performer. She took her place at the podium, cleared her throat, and began. Welcome, everyone. I'm so thrilled to see so many of you here tonight. Let's begin by reviewing last year's minutes. A voice cut through the air. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in the current HOA president. Heads turned. Mrs. Eleanor Price stood up slowly from the second row, voice calm but firm. Based on the documented violations of HOA bylaws, potential financial improprieties, and consistent abuse of power outlined in the report we've all received, I request this motion be considered before any other business. Gasps rippled through the crowd. This is completely out of order, Victoria stammered, her voice pitching higher. We have an agenda. This so-called report is nothing but lies from a disgruntled homeowner who refuses to comply with community standards. She shot a furious glare at me, but Eleanor was ready. She adjusted her glasses and calmly replied, Per Article 4, Section 9 of the HOA bylaws, a motion of no confidence may be considered first if seconded by 10% of homeowners present. More than a dozen hands shot into the air. Voices echoed, I second. Victoria's face turned pale. She clutched the sides of the podium, knuckles white. None of this is true, she cried. You're being manipulated. This man, he's building a wall to defy the community, not protect it. A hand went up from the back. I've lived here for 15 years, said Tom, standing tall. That man helped me fix my garage door last month. You fined me for flying a flag. I think it's time we decide who's really disrespecting this community. The room erupted in murmurs of agreement. Some clapped, others nodded solemnly. And then came the vote. One by one, hands raised. 92 in favor. 3 abstained. 2 opposed. Victoria, and the neighbor whose yard looked like a catalog page. Silence fell. Victoria staggered back, her voice a whisper. You can't do this. But the microphone had already been shut off. Richard Caldwell, the vice president, someone I'd rarely seen speak, stepped up to the front, clearing his throat. As acting interim president, he began, I hereby suspend all current violation notices until they can be reviewed. I will form a special audit committee to review financial records from the last 3 years, and effective immediately, Victoria Grant is removed from office. Gasps turned into applause. And me? I sat quietly in the back, watching it all unfold. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoration, about truth, about community. Victoria glared at me as she was asked to surrender her office keys and all HOA documents. But I didn't rise to meet her stare. I'd already won. My wall, solid, code-compliant and unshakable, stood as a symbol of what happens when someone finally says, enough. And I wasn't done yet, because the final chapter hadn't been written. And Victoria? She wasn't walking away quietly. The night after the vote, Sunnyside Ridge felt different. The air seemed lighter. Neighbors who used to avoid eye contact were now waving from across the street. Kids rode their bikes a little more freely. The newsletter that once read like a list of threats now sat in recycling bins, unread and irrelevant. And Victoria Grant? She was nowhere to be seen. Her reign had ended not with a bang, but with a quiet unraveling in front of the very people she once ruled through intimidation. But I knew better than to assume she'd just disappear. Because power, once tasted, doesn't go down without a final bite. I was returning home from a late run to the hardware store when I heard footsteps behind me. Sharp, fast, purposeful. I turned just as Victoria appeared at the edge of my driveway. Her flawless bob was slightly disheveled, strands out of place like cracks in her porcelain armor. Her eyes, once calculated and cool, now burned with wild resentment. You think you've won, she hissed. That you're some kind of hero for this neighborhood. But you're not. You're a manipulative little man who orchestrated all of this to humiliate me. I didn't flinch. I was tired, not just from the physical work, but from the weight of it all. No, Victoria, I said softly. You did this to yourself. I just refuse to let it continue. She jabbed a trembling finger at my chest, stopping just short of contact. You exploited loopholes, turned people against me. You twisted everything I built into some kind of Of conspiracy. I followed the rules, I replied. Your rules, every single one. I didn't twist anything. I just exposed what was already broken. She stared at me, breath shallow, hands clenched. This isn't over. Before I could respond, another voice entered the night. I think it is. It was Mrs. Eleanor Price, emerging from the sidewalk with Richard Caldwell beside her, and a third figure I didn't recognize at first. A tall man in a gray suit with a leather folder under his arm. We've just conducted a preliminary review of the HOA's bank records, Eleanor said, her voice calm and steady. Would you care to explain, Ms. Grant, why $20,000 of association funds were transferred to your personal account last month? Victoria's jaw dropped. What are you talking about? She stammered. The landscaping company you hired, your brother-in-law's firm, was charging nearly double the market rate, Richard added, and there's no competitive bidding process on file for any of the major projects you approved. Victoria's lips parted, but no words came. For the first time since I met her, she was speechless. The man in the suit stepped forward. I'm with the county auditor's office. We received a formal complaint, and after today's board vote, we've expedited our investigation. We'll be reviewing the HOA's expenditures for the past 3 years. Victoria backed away, 1 foot at a time, like a queen retreating from a throne that had turned to ash beneath her. I'll speak to my attorney, she muttered. I suggest you do, Eleanor replied, because what we've uncovered so far is just the beginning. Victoria didn't speak again. She turned, her heels clicking in uneven rhythm, and walked off into the night. And just like that, the queen had fallen. Weeks passed. My wall was finished, solid, symmetrical, and lined with decorative planters filled with desert blooms approved by the HOA. Neighbors complimented it daily. One even asked if I'd help design something similar for their property. I never joined the HOA board. I never wanted power. What I wanted, what I fought for, was peace, fairness, a place where people didn't live in fear of petty tyranny disguised as community order. But the battle left its mark. I saw the damage Victoria had done, not just to budgets or bylaws, but to people. Good people who had felt small in their own homes for years. So I wrote one final letter. I submitted a proposal for a new rule, a transparency clause that would require all HOA meetings to be recorded, all financial documents made available online, and all violation notices to include photographic evidence and specific code citations. It passed unanimously. Sunnyside Ridge would never be the same again. One spring afternoon, I sat on my porch, watching the sun cast golden light across the fresh blooms along my wall. A small hand tugged at my sleeve. It was Liam, the boy from 2 doors down. Mr. Blake, he said shyly, my mom says you're like the Batman of the neighborhood. I laughed. Tell your mom I prefer Iron Man. I get to build things. He giggled and ran off. And in that moment, I realized something. This wasn't just about walls or rules or revenge. It was about the kind of world we allow to grow around us. Some people build fences to keep others out. Others build them to protect what matters inside. And sometimes, just sometimes, a wall can become a symbol, not of division, but of strength, courage, and the simple act of standing up when no one else will. Sometimes the only way to beat the system is to know it better than the ones who built it. Here is a powerful and emotionally resonant 300-word conclusion in English, designed to wrap up the story, deliver a meaningful life lesson, and encourage viewer engagement for the story forge. In the end, this wasn't just a battle over hedges, walls, or rule books. It was a fight for dignity, for fairness, for the right to live in peace without fear of petty authority. Ethan Blake didn't set out to be a hero. He wasn't looking to challenge the system or become a symbol for resistance. He simply wanted to protect what was his. But when the system turned against him, when the rules were used not for order but for control, he made a choice to stand up, armed not with rage, but with reason. And that's the lesson we can all carry forward. In life, we will all face our own versions of Victoria Grant, those who manipulate the rules, who hide behind power, who believe no one will ever challenge them. But the truth is, we don't need to break the rules to fight back. We just need to understand them better, to use our voice, our knowledge, and our courage to build something stronger, something lasting. Ethan's wall wasn't just made of stone and mortar. It was built from integrity, patience, and quiet determination. And it stood, not just as a barrier, but as a reminder that real strength comes not from control, but from principle. So ask yourself, what would you do if you saw injustice right outside your door? Would you walk away, or would you build your own wall of truth? If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think twice about the systems we live in, don't forget to like, comment, and most importantly, subscribe to the Story Forge. Because here, we don't just tell stories, we forge them. One voice, one truth, one lesson at a time. What story should we forge next?